life. Chapter 1. The Curse of the Melting Diamond. The year was 1833, and the sun over Calcutta was not a friend. It was a hungry beast devouring the city alive, turning the marble floors of the British Raj into frying pans, where a man could literally cook an egg if he had the patience to stand the smell of his own melting boots. Inside the grand mansion of the wealthy merchant Lala Hardayal, the air was so thick with humidity that you could slice it with a sword, and yet, the Lala sat there, sweating like a fountain, fanning himself with a silk hand fan that did nothing but move the hot air from his left ear to his right. He was waiting for something impossible, a miracle that had traveled 15,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, through the burning equator, inside the wooden belly of a ship called the Tuscany. Suddenly, the heavy teak doors burst open, and in ran his youngest servant, Gapu, a boy whose legs moved faster than his brain, and whose eyes were bulging out of his head like a pair of overripe guavas. Lala Ji! Oh, Lala Ji! The white stone has arrived at the Hooghly port, but the British sailors are crying because the stone is bleeding. Gapu shouted, tripping over a Persian rug and sliding across the floor like a wet soap bar. Lala Hardayal jumped up, his belly wobbling with a mix of excitement and terror, because he knew that the bleeding was actually the ice melting away into the thirsty soil of Bengal. He rushed to the port, the hot wind whipping his toddy, and there he saw it. A massive, shimmering block of ice, crystal clear and glowing like a fallen star, being lowered from the ship. The crowd gasped. Some people fell to their knees thinking it was a Himalayan deity, and one old man even tried to lick it, only to have his tongue get stuck to the freezing surface, leading to a comedic dance of pain that looked like a puppet on a string. But Lala Hardayal wasn't laughing. He was looking at the water dripping from the wooden crate, realizing that every drop was a silver coin vanishing into thin air. This was the moment his mind flashed back, 20 years into the past, to his grandfather's Haveli in Allahabad, where the old man used to whisper about the Barf Khana of the Mughals. He remembered his grandfather standing over a deep, dark pit, smelling of damp earth and ancient straw, explaining that if you want to defeat the sun, you must bury the coal deep inside the earth's womb. Remember, Hardayal, the old man had said while chewing a cold pan. The sun is a king, but the earth is a mother. She can hide anything from his burning eyes. Back in the present, at the docks, the American captain, a man with a beard like a bird's nest and a voice like grinding gravel, screamed at the coolies to move faster, but the heat was winning. Lala Hardayal stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a plan, and shouted, "Stop!" The Frozen Legacy, an ice-cold thriller. The sun over the British Raj wasn't just a star. It was a silent executioner, melting the very soul of anyone who dared to walk the streets of Calcutta in 1833. Imagine a world where the word cold was a myth, a luxury reserved for the gods or those who lived on the peaks of the Himalayas, while the common man drowned in his own sweat, praying for a miracle. People were dying not just of hunger, but of a heat so oppressive it felt like the sky was an iron lid on a boiling pot. But then, rumors began to swirl through the dusty bazaars like a cool breeze from a forbidden land. Whispers of a madman across the ocean in America named Frederick Tudor, who claimed he could harvest the winter itself and sell it to the tropics. They called him the Ice King. But to the skeptics in India, he was just another white man selling illusions, until the day a massive wooden ship named the Tuscany appeared on the horizon of the Hooghly River. It wasn't carrying gold, silk, or spices. Its belly was filled with something far more precious and far more fragile. 180 tons of pure, crystal-clear ice carved from the frozen ponds of Massachusetts. As the ship docked, a crowd gathered, a mix of curious peasants, greedy merchants, and sweating British officers, all staring at the mist rising from the wooden planks, unable to comprehend how a frozen block could survive a 4-month journey across the burning equator. This was the moment the world changed, the moment a desperate race against time and physics began, where every melting drop of water was a loss of fortune. But behind this miracle lay a secret, a technique stolen from the ancient Mughals and perfected by engineers who knew that to keep ice alive in a furnace, you didn't need magic. You needed the science of insulation, the darkness of underground pits, and a thick layering of rice husks that acted like a blanket against the sun's fury. Little did they know that this ice would spark wars, create comedy in the courts of Nawabs who tried to eat it like diamonds, and lead to a saga of betrayal where brother turned against brother for the control of the white gold. You are about to enter a world where ice was protected like a princess in a fortress, hidden in barf-khanas that were deeper than graves and more guarded than treasuries. And as we peel back the layers of time, you will see that the refrigerator in your kitchen is actually a tombstone for a glorious, forgotten empire of cold. You are carrying it like wood, but you must treat it like a bride. He grabbed a pile of discarded rice husks and coarse jute bags, throwing them over the ice block, explaining to the confused Americans that the air was the enemy. In India, we don't just fight the heat, we outsmart it, he chuckled, his comedy masking a brilliant scientific truth, that the rice husks trap tiny pockets of air, creating a primitive but powerful thermal barrier. As they loaded the covered blocks onto bullock carts lined with layers of charcoal and sawdust, the crowd followed them like a funeral procession for a king who refused to die. The journey to the city's first ice house began, a race against the ticking clock of physics, where every bump in the road threatened to shatter the precious cargo. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of a Cold War that would turn neighbors into rivals and make a simple cup of chilled water the most dangerous obsession in the history of the East India Company. Chapter 1 is complete. The ice has arrived, the flashback has revealed the secret of the Mughals, and the white gold is now being transported under heavy insulation. Would you like me to move straight into Chapter 2, where the struggle to build the perfect ice house begins and the Ice King faces his first major betrayal? Chapter 2: The Fortress of Frost and the Salt Betrayal. The bullock carts groaned under the weight of the American ice, their wooden wheels screeching like banshees as they carved deep ruts into the dusty heart of Calcutta, while Lala Hardayal stood atop the lead carriage, waving a wet handkerchief like a war flag to clear the sea of shocked onlookers. The air was a thick blanket of spice and sweat, but inside the jute-wrapped crates, a silent battle was being fought against the laws of thermodynamics, as the ice began to sweat, creating a microclimate of cold that confused the flies buzzing around the oxen's ears. Lala knew that every second the sun touched those crates, the white gold was crying away its value, so he screamed at the drivers to lash the bulls harder, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man who had staked his entire ancestral Haveli on a frozen gamble. They finally reached the construction site of the ice house, a massive circular stone building with walls 3 feet thick, designed not to keep people in but to keep the heat out, looking more like a windowless tomb than a warehouse of luxury. As the coolies began unloading the blocks, a rival merchant named Chimanlal, a man with a mustache so long it looked like 2 sleeping cobras, stepped out from the shadows with a smirk that smelled of coriander and malice. "Hardayal, you fool, you are trying to trap the wind in a cage made of stone," Chimanlal laughed, his belly shaking with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a dholak. "By the time the moon rises, your diamonds will be a puddle of muddy water for the street dogs to drink." Lala Hardayal didn't flinch. Instead, he remembered a flashback from his youth in the salt flats of Rajasthan, where he had seen nomads chilling their water by wrapping leather skins in wet cloth and burying them in piles of coarse salt. He realized that to save the ice, he didn't just need shade. He needed a chemical shield, a way to lower the freezing point and fight the humidity of the Bengal swamps. He ordered Gapu to bring bags of unrefined salt and sawdust, shouting instructions that sounded like a mad scientist's manifesto. "Mix the salt with the sawdust. Layer it like a wedding cake. The salt will suck the soul out of the moisture, and the sawdust will trap the breath of the ice." The comedy of the situation peaked when Gapu, in his overeager clumsiness, accidentally tripped and fell into a vat of wet sawdust, emerging like a swamp monster, causing the British guards to point their muskets at him in pure confusion. But the science was working. As they packed the ice blocks into the deep, dark pit of the ice house, covering them with the salt sawdust mixture and capping it with a double-layered wooden roof stuffed with wool, the temperature inside the chamber dropped so sharply that the sweat on Lala's forehead turned into a thin crust of salt. Just as the last block was secured, a loud crack echoed through the chamber, not from the ice but from the betrayal that Chimanlal had orchestrated behind the scenes. He had bribed the water carriers to sabotage the drainage system of the pit, knowing that if the melting water pooled at the bottom, it would act like a hot bath, melting the entire fortune from the bottom up. Lala Hardayal looked down and saw the dark shimmer of rising water at his feet, realizing that his fortress of frost was about to become a pool of ruin unless he could find a way to drain the heat before the sun rose again over the horizon. Chapter 3. The Dance of the Draining Devils. The water was rising inside the dark pit of the ice house like a silent assassin, swirling around Lala Hardayal's ankles as the cold began to bite into his skin with the intensity of 1,000 tiny needles. Chimanlal's sabotage was perfect. The drainage pipes were choked with heavy clay, and the legendary white gold was now sitting in a lukewarm bath of its own blood, melting away at a rate that would turn the entire fortune into a swamp by midnight. Lala stood there in the flickering torchlight, his breath turning into mist, and for a second, the comedy of his life flashed before his eyes. A man who wanted to sell winter in a land of eternal fire, now drowning in the very thing he sought to protect. Gapu was frantically trying to scoop the water out with a brass bucket, slipping and sliding on the wet stone, his screams of "Bachao!" echoing through the hollow chamber like a drowning crow. But Lala Hardayal's mind was elsewhere. He was pulled back into a flashback, 30 years ago, to a dusty construction site in Agra where he had watched Persian architects build fountains that defied gravity using nothing but the pressure of the earth and the slope of the land. He remembered an old mason with hands as rough as sandpaper, explaining the siphon principle, how water could be forced to travel uphill if the vacuum was strong enough and the heart was brave enough. "Science is like a stubborn mule, Hardayal," the old man had chuckled while wiping sweat with a dirty turban. "It won't move unless you trick it into thinking it's going home." Back in the freezing darkness of the pit, Lala Hardayal's eyes snapped open with a wild, hungry look that made Gapu stop his clumsy splashing in fear. "Gapu, stop acting like a fish and start acting like a man. Fetch me the longest leather pipes from the tannery and every ounce of mustard oil you can find," he roared, his voice trembling with a mix of cold and adrenaline. As the pipes arrived, Lala didn't just try to pump the water out. He created a human chain of laborers, greasing the pipes with mustard oil to make them airtight, and using a massive leather bellows to suck the air out of the tubes. It was a scene of pure cinematic madness. A group of half-naked, shivering men in the middle of a Calcutta night, fighting a battle of air pressure against a rising tide of melted ice, while Chimanlal watched from the shadows, his smirk slowly turning into a scowl of disbelief. The educational magic began to happen as the vacuum took hold. Suddenly, with a sound like a giant gasping for breath, the stagnant water started to gush out of the pit through the leather pipes, flowing away into the street drains. Lala had exploited the siphon effect, using the height difference between the pit and the outer street to drain the disaster, proving that even in 1833, a sharp mind was more powerful than a corrupt rival. As the water level dropped, Lala quickly ordered the men to pour a fresh layer of charcoal and dry coconut husks around the base, creating a new, absorbent floor that would trap any future moisture before it could touch the precious ice blocks. The heat of the Calcutta night was still outside, waiting like a hungry predator, but inside the stone fortress the temperature had stabilized and the ice sat silent and majestic once more. But just as Lala Hardayal took a sigh of relief, he heard the sound of galloping horses and the clanking of swords. The British authorities had arrived, led by a suspicious colonel who had been told by Chimanlal that Lala was hiding illegal gunpowder inside the ice house. The battle for the ice was no longer just about science and sabotage. It was now a matter of life, death, and the terrifying politics of the British Empire. The frozen bluff and the colonel's tongue. The heavy, iron-studded doors of the ice house shivered under the rhythmic thumping of British musket butts, as Colonel Archibald, a man whose face was the color of a boiled beetroot, and whose temper was shorter than a burnt matchstick, roared for Lala Hardyal to surrender his illegal arsenal. Beside him, Chimanlal stood like a gloating hyena, whispering into the colonel's ear that the cold mist leaking from the vents was not ice, but a chemical smoke used to hide barrels of rebel gunpowder smuggled from the north. Lala Hardyal felt the cold sweat on his neck turn into ice crystals as he realized that in the eyes of the British Raj, a man with a secret was a man with a noose, and his fortress of frost was about to be blown apart by cannon fire. Gapu was shaking so hard, his teeth sounded like a pair of rhythmic castanets. "Lala ji, we are finished. They will hang us from the banyan tree and use our dodas as flags." But Lala, with a sudden flash of comedic brilliance, grabbed a silver tray, a bottle of expensive rosewater syrup, and a small jagged shard of the American ice. He remembered a flashback from his childhood in the Mughal-influenced courts of Lucknow, where he had seen a hakim use kalam shora, saltpeter, mixed with water to create a freezing mixture that could turn a simple grape into a crunchy, frozen jewel. The hakim had winked at him and said, "Hardyal, the English conquer with lead, but you must conquer with the senses. A man with a frozen tongue cannot shout orders for a hanging." Lala threw open the doors just as the colonel was about to give the order to fire, stepping out into the moonlight not with a weapon, but with a shimmering glass filled with crushed ice and crimson syrup. "Colonel Saab, before you execute a humble merchant, would you care to taste the soul of the North Pole?" Lala shouted, his voice dripping with more honey than the syrup in his hand. The colonel paused, his musket-wielding soldiers staring in awe at the smoking glass that defied the 40-degree midnight heat. Chimanlal screamed that it was poison, but the colonel, driven by a thirst that felt like a desert in his throat, snatched the glass and took a massive, greedy gulp of the slushy ice. The reaction was instantaneous. The colonel's eyes bulged. His face turned from beetroot red to a ghostly pale blue, and he let out a strangled gasp as the brain freeze hit him like a lightning bolt from the heavens. He began to hop on one leg, clutching his forehead, while Gapu whispered loudly, "Look! The ghost of the ice has grabbed his brain," causing the soldiers to suppress their laughter behind their gloved hands. But as the freezing sensation subsided, replaced by a cooling wave of relief that he hadn't felt since leaving London, the colonel's anger melted faster than a candle in a furnace. He looked at the ice, then at the empty pit which contained nothing but shimmering blocks and the scent of sawdust, and turned his fury toward Chimanlal. "You blundering idiot!" the colonel bellowed, his voice returning with a frosty edge. "You called this gunpowder? This is heaven in a glass." He ordered his men to stand down and demanded that Lala Hardyal provide cold rations for the British barracks, effectively turning the ice house into a government-protected zone. Lala bowed low, hiding a smirk of victory, knowing that he had just used the science of endothermic reaction, where the ice absorbed the heat from the colonel's very blood, to turn a death sentence into a business contract. But as the soldiers marched away, Lala looked back into the shadows of the ice house and saw a new problem. The insulation was failing, and a strange, fuzzy fungus was starting to grow on the damp sawdust, threatening to rot the entire 180-ton treasure from within. The fungi feud and the charcoal shield. Lala Hardyal stood inside the belly of the ice house, his heart sinking faster than a stone in the Ganges as he smelled a sharp, sour stench rising from the very layers that were supposed to protect his white gold. The damp sawdust, soaked by the earlier sabotage and the humid Calcutta air, had begun to ferment, turning into a fuzzy gray monster of fungus that was eating away the insulation and generating its own heat, a biological furnace in the middle of a frozen tomb. Gapu was poking at the mold with a stick, shouting that the ice ghost had caught a fever, while the ice blocks themselves started to look pitted and shrunken, like old men losing their teeth. Lala knew that if the sawdust rotted, the heat from the ground would seep in, and his 180 tons of American winter would turn into a warm, stinking puddle before the next moonrise, leaving him bankrupt and at the mercy of the British tax collectors. His mind suddenly raced back in a flashback, 15 years ago, to the charcoal kilns of the Himalayan foothills, where he had once stayed with a tribe of nomadic hunters. He remembered watching them preserve meat in the middle of summer by burying it in deep pits lined with charred wood and crushed bones, explaining that charcoal was the breath of the earth that could suck away both moisture and the invisible demons of decay. "Charcoal doesn't just sit there, boy," the tribal chief had grunted, his face black with soot. "It's a silent hunter that eats the wetness before the wetness eats your food." Lala's eyes lit up with the fire of a man who had found his weapon. He realized that while sawdust was a great insulator, in the swampy heat of Bengal, it was a breeding ground for rot, and he needed a material that was both a shield and a sponge. He screamed for Gapu to round up every charcoal burner in the city and buy every bag of activated carbon they could find, causing a comedic chaos in the local bazaar as Gapu ran around covered in black dust, looking like a confused demon. Chimanlal, watching from the street corner, laughed and told the passers-by that Hardayal had finally lost his mind and was now trying to turn his ice into coal to hide his failure. But inside the pit, the science was happening with a vengeance. Lala ordered the men to strip away the rotting sawdust and replace it with a thick 3-layer system, a base of scorched charcoal to kill the fungus and absorb the dampness, a middle layer of sun-dried coconut husks for air pockets, and a top seal of double-layered jute soaked in neem oil. It was a masterpiece of indigenous engineering, a DESI solution to a global physics problem, where the charcoal acted as a natural desiccant and an antimicrobial barrier, effectively cleaning the air around the ice. As the new insulation took hold, the sour smell vanished, replaced by the clean, earthy scent of burnt wood, and the temperature inside the pit plummeted once more, stabilizing the ice into a rock-hard, crystalline state. Lala Hardayal leaned against the stone wall, his clothes stained black with charcoal but his spirit shining bright, realizing he had just invented a more durable storage system than anything the Americans had suggested. However, his triumph was cut short when a messenger arrived, breathless and trembling, with a letter from the Calcutta High Court. Chimanlal had filed a lawsuit claiming that the ice house was a public health hazard, and tomorrow, a judge would arrive to decide whether to shut down the fortress forever. Chapter 6. The Frozen Trial and the Judge's Fever. The Calcutta High Court was a furnace of legal tension, where the heavy wooden fans pulled by tired punkawallas only served to circulate the smell of old paper and Chimanlal's cheap jasmine perfume. Judge Harrison, a man with a wig that looked like a nesting pigeon and a forehead dripping with judicial sweat, banged his gavel and demanded to know why Lala Hardayal shouldn't be thrown into prison for disturbing the public health with his melting magic. Chimanlal stood there, his mustache twitching with villainous joy, claiming that the ice house was breeding cold miasma, a mysterious Victorian disease that would turn the citizens of Calcutta into frozen statues. The crowd in the courtroom gasped, some people covering their noses with silk handkerchiefs, while Gapu sat in the corner, trying to look invisible but accidentally knocking over a stack of legal files with his oversized turban, causing a ripple of laughter that briefly broke the tension. Lala Hardayal stepped forward, not with a lawyer, but with a heavy wooden box wrapped in 7 layers of charcoal-stained jute, looking like a man carrying a piece of the moon itself. He remembered a flashback, 25 years ago, in the laboratories of a French scholar in Pondicherry, who had shown him how latent heat works, the secret energy that a substance absorbs or releases during a phase change without changing its temperature. The Frenchman had smiled and said, "Hardayal, remember, ice is not just frozen water. It is a thief that steals heat from its surroundings to stay alive, and if you manage its hunger, you can control the world." Back in the courtroom, Lala looked the judge straight in the eye and said, "My lord, you call it a disease, but I call it the cure for the very fever that is burning this city." He slowly unwrapped the box, and a ghostly white mist began to crawl across the floor of the courtroom, making the lawyers jump back in shock as if a spirit had been released. Lala didn't just show the ice, he performed a scientific stunt. He placed a hot, steaming bowl of Bengali fish curry next to a small block of his ice and covered them both with a glass dome. Within minutes, the courtroom watched in absolute silence as the steam from the curry vanished, and the heat was literally sucked into the ice, while the curry stayed fresh and the ice barely melted, proving the power of insulation and thermal equilibrium. "You see, my lord," Lala explained with a dramatic flourish, "the ice doesn't spread sickness. It eats the heat that rots our food and boils our blood." To prove his point, he offered the judge a glass of water that had been chilled to exactly 4 degrees Celsius, the magic number where water is most dense. As the judge took a sip, his eyes widened, his wig shifted slightly to the left, and a look of pure, unadulterated peace washed over his face, as if he had just been transported from the hell of Calcutta to the gardens of London in spring. Chimanlal tried to protest, shouting about evil spirits, but the judge silenced him with a cold stare and a refreshed voice, declaring that Lala's icehouse was not a hazard, but a public utility of the highest order. Lala Hardayal had won the legal war using pure physics and a bit of theatrical masala, but as he walked out of the court a hero, a dark cloud appeared on the horizon. Not a rain cloud, but the smoke of a massive fire. The city's main grain warehouse, located right next to the icehouse, had been set ablaze, and the extreme heat of the fire was now threatening to do what the sun and the lawyers couldn't: melt the entire 180-ton fortune in a single fiery hour. Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Inferno and the Frozen Shield. The sky over Calcutta had turned a bruised purple, choked by the thick, oily smoke rising from the neighboring grain warehouse, which was now a roaring dragon of fire, spitting embers like angry hornets onto the roof of the icehouse. The heat was so intense that the stone walls of the fortress began to radiate a warmth that made the air inside shimmer like a mirage, and for the first time, the white gold began to weep, not in drips, but in steady, rhythmic streams that sounded like a ticking death clock. Gapu was running around with a wet turban wrapped around his face, screaming that the Surya Devta had finally come down to claim his prize, while the crowd outside watched in horror, expecting the massive icehouse to either explode or vanish into a cloud of steam. Lala Hardayal stood in the center of the melting chamber, the smell of burning wheat filling his lungs, realizing that his charcoal and sawdust shield was no match for a fire that could melt lead. In that moment of fiery despair, his mind took a desperate leap back in time, a flashback to a freezing winter night in the mountains of Kashmir, where he had seen a village survive a forest fire by using a technique known as thermal massing. He remembered the village elder throwing thick, wet blankets of mud and river clay over their wooden huts, explaining that the earth doesn't just block heat, it swallows it, acting as a sacrificial layer that dies so the life inside can live. "Hardayal," the old man had whispered through a toothless grin, "the fire is a thief that only steals from the dry. Give it something wet to eat, and it will leave your heart alone." Lala's eyes snapped shut and then open, glowing with a frantic brilliance as he realized that the air between the burning warehouse and his ice was the real enemy. He didn't order his men to throw water on the fire. That was useless. Instead, he ordered them to create a wet mud buffer on the external walls of the icehouse, mixing the clay from the riverbank with the very water that was melting off the ice blocks. It was a scene of cinematic chaos, a line of men passing buckets of slushy mud, slapping it onto the scorching stone walls, while Gapu accidentally slipped and became a human mud ball, rolling across the courtyard and providing a momentary burst of tragic comedy that made the exhausted workers chuckle. The science was simple but legendary. The evaporative cooling from the wet mud began to fight the radiant heat of the fire. As the fire tried to bake the stone walls, the moisture in the mud evaporated first, consuming the thermal energy and preventing the internal temperature of the icehouse from skyrocketing. It was a physical standoff. The fire was trying to push the heat in, while the evaporating mud was pulling the heat away. Inside, the ice stopped weeping and returned to a solid, silent state, protected by a layer of desi mud that had turned the stone fortress into a giant unbaked earthen pot. By the time the sun rose, the grain warehouse was a pile of ash, but the icehouse stood tall, caked in dried, cracked mud, like an ancient warrior who had survived a massacre. Chimanlal, who had been seen near the warehouse with a torch the night before, tried to vanish into the morning mist, but his scorched eyebrows gave him away. However, as Lala Hardayal celebrated his victory, he noticed a strange phenomenon. The intense heat had caused a pressure buildup inside the sealed chamber, and the ice blocks had fused together into one single, massive 150-ton mountain of solid crystal. He had saved the ice from the fire, but now he had a new, impossible problem. How do you sell a diamond that is too big to fit through the door? 8. The Crystal Monster and the Copper Wire Whisper. The interior of the ice house had transformed into a shimmering, frozen cavern, where a single monolithic mountain of ice stood defiant, its surface so smooth and hard that the coolie's iron pick simply bounced off with a pathetic clink, leaving nothing but tiny white scratches. The fire's heat, followed by the sudden cooling, had caused a regelation effect. The blocks had partially melted at the contact points and then refrozen under immense pressure, welding 150 tons of ice into one solid, unbreakable diamond. Lala Hardayal stared at this giant monster, realizing that if he couldn't break it down, he couldn't sell it, and the British Army's contract would be breached by noon, leading to a prison cell that wouldn't be nearly as cool as his warehouse. Gapu, trying to be helpful, suggested using a small amount of leftover gunpowder to blast it apart, but Lala slapped his forehead, shouting that an explosion would turn the ice into mist and the ice house into a rain cloud. In the midst of this icy silence, Lala's mind drifted back 20 years, to a hidden workshop in the back streets of Benares, where a master sculptor was cutting through thick slabs of marble not with a heavy saw, but with a thin, vibrating wire and a trickle of abrasive sand. He remembered the old artisan saying, "Hardayal, force is for those who have no brains. If you want to cut a mountain, you must find its weakness, and every weakness has the width of a single hair." The sculptor had demonstrated how a thin line, under tension, creates quote, concentrated pressure that can slice through anything if the heat of friction is managed correctly. Lala's eyes snapped open as he grabbed a coil of thick copper wire and two heavy wooden handles, looking like a man about to perform a magic trick for a crowd of skeptics. He ordered Gapu to fetch a bucket of hot salt water and a long iron rod to act as a lever, while the workers watched in confusion as he wrapped the copper wire around the neck of the ice mountain. The science was a masterclass in pressure-induced melting. The copper wire, being a superb conductor of heat, combined with the immense tension Lala applied, began to bite into the ice, lowering the melting point exactly where the wire touched the surface. It was a cinematic tug-of-war, Lala and Gapu on one side, four muscular coolies on the other, pulling the wire back and forth in a rhythmic sawing motion that produced a high-pitched singing sound. As the wire heated up from the friction and the salt water, it sliced through the 150-ton block like a hot knife through butter, creating a perfectly straight, surgical cut that no iron pick could ever achieve. The comedy returned when the first massive slab finally broke free with a thunderous crack, sending Gapu flying backward into a pile of charcoal, emerging once again as a black ghost, but with a victorious grin on his soot-covered face. One by one, the giant blocks were liberated, their edges so sharp they could cut silk, and the line of bullock carts began to move toward the city once more. Lala Hardayal stood at the exit, sweat dripping from his chin even in the cold, knowing he had turned a disaster into a production line. But as the last cart left, he saw Chimanlal standing across the street, not with a torch or a lawyer, but with a strange, oily man wearing the uniform of a sanitary inspector. Chimanlal had realized that he couldn't melt the ice or stop the man, so he was now going to target the one thing the British feared more than fire: the deadly collar spirits hidden inside the water. The specter of cholera and the crystal purity. The air in the British cantonment was thick with a new kind of fear, a fear that traveled faster than a horse and struck harder than a bullet, the rumor of the Blue Death cholera. Chimanlal had played his final, most poisonous card. He had spread a whisper through the markets that the American ice was harvested from the stagnant, corpse-filled ponds of the West, and that Lala Hardayal was selling frozen plague to the unsuspecting citizens of Calcutta. The sanitary inspector, a man named Mr. Higgins who looked like he had been preserved in vinegar, stood at the gates of the ice house with a magnifying glass and a stern scowl, declaring that until the purity of the source was proven, not a single gram of ice would be allowed to touch a British lip. Lala Hardayal watched as his customers backed away in terror, and for a moment the white gold looked like a cursed treasure that no one dared to touch. In this moment of scientific slander, Lala's mind flashed back to a rainy afternoon in the laboratory of a wandering Buddhist monk, who was also a master of Rasa Shastra, the ancient science of minerals. The monk had shown him a simple, yet miraculous trick using a piece of fitkari, alum, and a beam of sunlight, explaining how certain substances could act as magnets for filth, dragging impurities to the bottom and leaving the water as clear as a Himalayan spring. Hardayal, the monk had said, tapping a copper vessel, nature provides the poison, but she also provides the filter. You just have to know which stone to throw into the darkness. Lala Hardayal didn't argue with Mr. Higgins. Instead, he laughed a hearty, theatrical laugh that echoed through the stone vaults and challenged the inspector to a public purity duel. He called Gapu to bring 3 glass jars, one filled with the city's tap water, one with river water, and one with a melted block of his American ice, and placed them on a white silk cloth in the middle of the square. The comedy reached its peak as Gapu, trying to look like a professional scientist, put on a pair of oversized spectacles and began to stir the jars with a silver spoon as if he were making a magical potion. Lala then performed the Tyndall effect demonstration before the term was even popularized. He took a powerful bullseye lantern and shone a concentrated beam of light through the 3 jars. The tap water was filled with dancing dust and murky shadows. The river water was a cloudy mess of organic debris. But when the light hit the melted ice water, it passed through with such crystalline perfection that the beam almost disappeared, leaving nothing but a pure, ghostly glow. "Look, Sahib!" Lala shouted, his voice ringing with the authority of a legend. "The ice is born of the American frost, where the water is frozen so fast that the impurities are pushed out of the crystal lattice. This is not just water, it is a diamond that has been washed by the clouds." To seal the victory, he took a piece of alum and swirled it in the other jars, showing how the dirt clumped together, while the ice water remained unchanged, proving its inherent purity. Mr. Higgins was stunned. The science of fractional crystallization, the process where freezing purifies water by excluding solutes, had just been proven in a dusty Calcutta street. The inspector took a sip, sighed in relief, and cleared the shipment, while Chimanlal watched from a distance, his face turning a shade of green that matched the scum on a stagnant pond. But the victory was bittersweet. As Lala celebrated, a massive storm began to brew over the Bay of Bengal. The Great Cyclone of 1833 was coming, and the ice house, for all its stone strength, was sitting right in the path of a tidal wave that threatened to wash the entire frozen empire into the sea. Chapter 9. The Final Thaw and the Legend of the Ice King. The sky didn't just turn dark, it turned an eerie, bruised charcoal green as the Bay of Bengal exhaled a roar that shook the very foundations of Calcutta. The Great Cyclone of 1833 was no longer a threat, it was a monster at the door, and the ice house stood like a lone soldier against a tidal wave of wind and rain that threatened to turn the city into an underwater graveyard. Lala Hardayal stood on the roof of his fortress, his dhoti whipping in the gale like a frantic bird, watching as the Hooghly River breached its banks, sending a surge of salt water toward his precious white gold. Gapu was huddled inside, hugging a giant block of ice and praying to every god he could name, his voice barely a squeak against the thunder. "Lala ji, the earth is shaking, the water is rising, and even the ice is shivering." In this final hour of chaos, Lala's mind didn't go back to a teacher or a monk. It went back to his own journey, a flashback of all the chapters of his life. The fire, the heat, the lawsuits, and the sabotage. He realized that the greatest secret of ice wasn't how to keep it frozen, but how to respect its phase change, the transition from solid to liquid, from presence to memory. He remembered his grandfather's final words on his deathbed, Hardayal, "Nothing lasts forever in this heat, not even kings. The goal is not to live forever, but to leave a chill in the air after you are gone." Lala scrambled down into the pit, not to fight the flood, but to manage it. He ordered the men to use the remaining charcoal and sandbags to create a pressure valve at the base of the icehouse. As the cyclone hit with full force, ripping the wooden roofs off nearby mansions, the icehouse held firm because of its circular aerodynamic design, which allowed the wind to slide around its stone curves rather than smashing against them. But the water was the real enemy. The saltwater flood reached the gates, and Lala knew that if it entered the pit, the salt would melt his entire stock in minutes due to the freezing point depression he had once used to save his life. With a roar that rivaled the storm, Lala and Gapu pushed a massive, final 5-ton block of ice against the main drainage vent, effectively using the ice to block the water from entering. It was a poetic sacrifice, using the very thing he loved to protect the empire he had built. For 6 hours the storm raged, a cinematic symphony of howling winds and crashing waves, while inside, the cold air became a silent sanctuary. When the sun finally broke through the clouds the next morning, the city of Calcutta was a mess of mud and debris, but the icehouse stood tall, its white stone walls gleaming like a pearl in the sun. The ice had survived, but more importantly, the legend was born. People emerged from their ruined homes to find Lala Hardayal distributing cold water and crushed ice to the injured and the thirsty, turning his luxury business into a mission of mercy. Even Chimanlal, found shivering and wet in a ditch, was offered a chilled glass by Gapu, who winked and said, "Don't worry, Chimanlalji, this ice doesn't have a ghost, but it sure has a heart." As the years passed, the ice houses of India became the ancestors of the modern refrigerator, but the story of the man who brought the American winter to the Indian summer was never forgotten. Lala Hardayal didn't just sell ice, he sold the impossible, proving that with a little bit of science, a lot of masala, and a heart that refused to melt, one could turn even the most burning desert into a kingdom of cold. The screen fades to black, as a single, crystal-clear ice cube falls into a glass of golden sherbet, the sound of the clink echoing through time, reminding us that before the machines, there was the magic of the Ice Kings.